Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Hey gang, this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories is brought to you by 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. If you're a serious comic book collector, just starting out your collection, or maybe you're just a casual reader, then you have to check out 3D Comics in Lancaster, New York. From graded comics, custom art lithographs, limited edition prints and statues, 3D Comics is a must-see for the serious enthusiast, but the laid-back atmosphere is perfect for anyone with a love for comic books and more. They also specialize in custom art Funko Pops, taking regular Funko Pops and having a team of artists do original art on the boxes. Each comes with a certificate of authenticity. Located at 32 Central Ave in the heart of the village of historic Lancaster, New York, 3D Comics is open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 6, with special appointments available on Sundays. Find them online at 3dcomicsandmore.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. And if you prefer to shop online, owner Joel Sharmani has tons of items available on eBay. Find a quick link to that on the shop's homepage. They also feature in-store appearances from today's hottest artists, special offers, and every Wednesday is New Comic Book Day. Give them a call at 716-860-7837, visit them online right now at 3dcomicsandmore.com, or better yet, just stop on in. But no matter where you are around the round world, 3D Comics is your destination for the best in comic books, custom art, and beyond. 3D Comics and More. That's the number 3, the letter D, comicsandmore.com. Tell them Uncle Josh sent you. Home Alone, submitted by Name Not Important. Let me start off by saying that I know your rule about thou shalt not send creepypastas, and I assure you, what I'm about to tell you has a 100% true story guarantee. I apologize for the length ahead of time. With that said, I would like to start off by saying that I'm not one of those guys that thinks everything weird that happens to me is automatically ghosts or something. I believe in them, but I'm just not sure about what this was at all. So here's my story. This happened to me in the summer of my freshman year in high school, going into sophomore year. It was the summer of 2010. I was a 3-sport athlete in high school, so that meant summers were always busy with summer workouts and conditioning. Mind you, I live in northeast Georgia in the southern U.S., and it gets pretty damn hot outside in July and August. And a side note, southern heat is like getting boiled alive at times due to the 95% humidity. Anyway, we had just gotten out of football conditioning practice, and we would all usually grab a bite to eat for lunch, and then head to the river to cool off before we had our afternoon practice. But seeing as how everyone was busy and couldn't go, I decided to just head home. Our house had 2 stories, and my bedroom was on the 2nd floor overlooking the driveway and garage. I knew I was home alone because my sister was at our grandparents' house 30 miles away, and my parents were at work. So I took a shower in my parents' bathroom because they had a cool stand-up shower. As I was jamming out to my iTunes playlist on my phone, I kept hearing people talking in the house. When I turned the music off, I heard what sounded like 2 big men talking to each other in the living room. I got really scared and ran and got my dad's shotgun out of his safe that conveniently sat in a safe 10 feet away from the bathroom. I loaded it and cautiously entered the living room. And there was nothing. I searched high and low, all through the house, and not a damn thing. I could have sworn that I heard what sounded like 2 very deep and gravelly voices talking to each other through the wall, but I couldn't find the source. All the windows and doors were locked, and nothing was out of the ordinary. I chalked it up as a creation of an overactive teenage mind and just went on with my day. It was midday at this point and hotter than the gates of hell outside, so I decided to stay inside and go upstairs to my room, gun in hand, and turned my Xbox on to play a little Call of Duty World at War. At least it was comfy in our house's air conditioning. As I was playing, all of a sudden I had an overwhelming sense of fear wash over me. I can't explain it other than, some bad shit is about to happen, and you don't know what it is or why. So I got up, looked around the entire upstairs floor, under beds and closets. I even looked in the trash cans and under pillows. Again, nothing. I just couldn't shake the feeling of something bad about to happen. I tried shaking it off, or writing it off to Home Alone paranoia in a fairly large house, and went back to playing my game, but I kept the volume lower just in case. About 10 minutes into playing, I heard extremely heavy footsteps directly under me in the kitchen. It sounded like and felt like an NFL lineman was walking around in steel-toed boots on hardwood floors by the way the house vibrated with every step. I looked outside for my dad's truck thinking he got home early and I just didn't know he was there. But it confused me because my dad isn't that big, and his truck wasn't in the driveway. I was 6'2", 250 at the time, and easily outweighed him and was 3 inches taller than him. Confused, I walked to the top of the stairs, and for reasons I will never know, I yelled, "Hey Dad, I'm upstairs playing Xbox if you need me," instead of silently checking out who it was. Nothing but silence responded. I was so scared at this point and knew I might have just fucked up, so I ran back to my room, stood beside my bed trying to think about my next move. Before I could think of anything, I heard the footsteps turn into what sounded like sprinting to the bottom of the stairs and then abruptly pause. Then they started up the stairs. When whoever or whatever it was started up the stairs, it was horrifying how inhuman it sounded. I mean, the steps were so fast up the stairs, it was as if whoever it was running up the stairs on all fours like an animal, but faster than anything I've ever heard run. It was like a dog running, but in fast forward. I mean, who or whatever it was so heavy and strong that the house literally shook at each step. It vibrated the entire house to the point that some of the stuff on the bookshelves in my room fell over and onto the floor. I could feel the violent vibration of each step. I was obviously shitting myself at this point, and all I could think of was to grab the gun and hide in my closet, which was open next to me. I ran in as fast as I could and hid there and waited to see if some shack-sized dude walked into my room looking for me. But no one ever did. I stood in my closet, literally soaking wet from sweat and shaking like a leaf on a tree for 20 minutes, just waiting. At the 20-minute mark, I realized that the shaking of the house and inhumanly fast stomping of the stairs stopped right at the top. I don't know how to explain it, but I just knew that it knew where I was. I eventually grew a sufficiently sized beanbag after a hearty amount of praying, and was ready to square up with whoever it was that was scaring the shit out of me. I walked to the stairs with the gun ready to put a basketball-sized hole in someone's chest. And when I creeped up to the top of the stairs, surprise, there was no one. I stood in the purest confusion I have ever felt in my life until I looked at the carpet on the stairs. There were these 4-toed feet indentations on the carpet on the stairs. I mean, they were absolutely massive, like 15 inches long, 10 inches wide. No, we didn't have huge stairs, but they were big enough to fit my size 13 shoe on with little overhang. There was one print on the top step, which is how I got a good view of the full print. The toes of it were like 8 inches long from what I could tell, and the prints on the stairs looked like it was running on the balls of its feet. Only the front half of the print was visible, but the heel wasn't visible until it got to the top where the prints abruptly stopped. I took a picture of the print with my shitty iPhone camera, and then I searched the entire house once again, finding nothing, to my frustration. Nothing heavy fell over in the house that could have caused that to happen. I mean, in fact, everything was pristine. Not one thing moved out of place, except in my room, where it looked like an earthquake happened. My stuff was everywhere on the floor. I freaked the fuck out at that point and ran outside to my truck and sat in it until I had to go to practice again. When I got home from my second and last practice of the day, I showed my parents the picture of the print on the carpet, and they absolutely did not believe me, thinking I was playing a trick on them. Honestly, I had replaced a few family pictures with that picture of the astronaut sloth a few days prior, so they had grounds for thinking that, and I didn't blame them. They still to this day don't believe me, and there were no reports of earthquakes anywhere around us at the time. I have no clue what it was or what happened, and I can't find anything online from other people telling a similar story, but I think my praying helped me as I've never experienced something like that since then. I got rid of that phone years ago, and I would have sent that picture to you. What I wrote was 100% true, and I wish I could prove it, but I can't. I hope this ends up on your channel. I'm a new subscriber, and you've inspired me to tell the stories that I've been keeping to myself all these years. I think I finally found my campfire. A Frightening Lunch Break by Eris Kratos. The story I want to share with you happened a year ago, not long after the beginning of our first semester. I was 20 then, and I used to hang out near my university a lot at that time of the year because the weather was still really nice and warm, and my university was adjacent to a park. As we had a 3-hour break, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to eat lunch in the park rather than the cafeteria. I said yes, and we went there. It was a regular school day, probably a Thursday, and the place was filled with kids, students, and people walking their dogs, so I guess not really that empty. It may seem odd to underline this, but I rarely go by myself to a park if there's no one else around because it makes me feel nervous, kind of vulnerable. I'm an overly anxious person, don't judge me. But on this day, the place was crowded, and we hardly managed to find a place somewhere on the grass for us to sit. We ate, talked, and enjoyed the sunny weather for a good hour. And after an hour, the park was way emptier than when we arrived. Almost all the children had left, and we were quite on our own. We both wanted to smoke a little before returning to classes, and now that we wouldn't bother anyone with the smoke, we rolled 2 joints. I know it's not especially a good thing, but it was our little habit when we hung out together. Anyway, the past belongs to the past, right? I was focused on rolling up when my friend suddenly asked me, "Do you see them?" I looked in the same direction as her, but I couldn't see what she was talking about. She pointed, "Those guys with the bag. They're staring at us." And I saw them. 50 meters away from us, 2 guys who seemed a little older than us were standing in the middle of the way looking intensely at us. They had literally no expressions on their face, though. I'm kind of used to creepy guys, whether they are polite or much more intrusive. You know, those who follow you in the streets, those who are inexplicably staring at you in the bus for 30 minutes, those who won't leave your side until you give them your number. It can be really easy to get rid of them, but those kinds of encounters are often awkward, embarrassing, or worse. So I felt a little uncomfortable, although I wasn't worried. As I kept looking at them, I understood that they were going to talk to us. I asked my friend if she knew them, and she said no, adding that she had hoped they would not come over to say hi. Unfortunately, 3 minutes later, they were right in front of us, smiling. There were 2. The first to talk introduced himself as Manny. He was a small, short-haired guy who was obviously high on drugs, and I wouldn't know which ones to be honest, but it was obvious. The other one was a tall, pale, quiet guy. I can't remember his name. Let's call him Steve to make things easier. Manny talked and smiled a lot. He introduced himself and his friend, asked us about our day, and praised the warm temperatures. He seemed either unable to shut up or desperately trying to play it cool with us. Before we could tell him to leave, he just invited himself to join us on the grass, assuming that we would be okay with it. As a sort of welcoming gift, he opened his bag. It was a huge plastic bag, one you would take to do some groceries. And he showed us a 4.5-liter bottle of vodka. I couldn't help but judge them. It was like 1 in the afternoon in a park in daylight, so it kind of felt ridiculous to me. His friend handed us a tiny and already used paper cup. We declined the offer, saying that we needed to stay sober. We had classes to attend to. Unfortunately, they already drank a fair amount of vodka, and they kept insisting until my friend told them, "I'm not the type of person who drinks vodka right after lunch. I either drink it on a Friday night with my friends or pass my turn. Don't ask again." I should tell you now, my friend is not a scaredy cat at all. To be honest, she's the bravest person I've ever met. She's never uncomfortable in front of strangers. Usually when she's bothered by a weird guy, she either acts weirder than him to make him feel more uncomfortable, or laughs it off, making jokes and acting friendly until she tells him to leave because she'd rather be alone. Or in the worst case, she kicks his ass and leaves. So, even if she didn't want their company, she was still unperturbed and relaxed, way more than I was, and it felt good to have her by my side. They must have felt that she was serious because they stopped insisting, and instead they started to ask us things like, "Are you students? Do you have a boyfriend? Can I have your number?" and so on. We were both already in relationships, and certainly not interested in the 2 of them, but it didn't stop them from flirting. They kept complimenting us in a heavy, unpleasant, clumsy way, and we began to feel embarrassed. We could clearly tell that the alcohol was unleashing them. They were annoyingly openly flirting, and it escalated quickly from sympathetic remarks on the way we were dressed to nasty sexual advances. As I said, we were not interested, but they didn't take no for an answer. I was so uncomfortable that I avoided eye contact as much as I could while trying to figure a way for us to get out of that situation. At that point, 2 other guys, supposedly their friends, came and sat down with us, even though we didn't tell them that they could. They looked dirty and stoned, and one of them had a scrawny dog full of fleas, not really reassuring, but we kept all of our thoughts to ourselves. My friend said something like, "We should probably go back to school now," but it didn't work the way we planned. They offered to come with us, claiming that it was not the first time they had crashed classes just for fun. We replied, "No thanks, we don't want to get into trouble," but Manny insisted again. We declined, and he kept insisting, saying, "Don't worry, it's no big deal." And suddenly he pulled a gun out of his pants and brandished it in front of us with a proud expression on his face. We immediately stopped smiling. First, because we live in France, carrying guns is neither allowed nor usual, and second, because now we felt trapped. The gun looked old but real, heavy and extremely dangerous in his drunken hands. This was not funny anymore. I was genuinely afraid of what could happen next. One of his friends, the one with the dog, let's call him Nick, started to panic, got up and said, "Are you fucking crazy? Don't you know I got heroin on me?" To which Manny replied, "Chill out, there's no cops out here." His friend shook his head and took his bag, ready to get out of there. Then Manny, pretending to be aiming at Steve, told us with a big carnivorous smile that he could totally shoot him without being in trouble. Steve seemed a little nervous. Nick walked away yelling that he didn't want to be seen with us because it was too risky, and I couldn't disagree. It was the middle of the day in an almost empty park, so the scene seemed quite unreal. I just thought, crap, I've never been this close to a gun, and the guy who owns it is a drunk guy who doesn't want us to leave. I mean, it looked bad. He turned towards me, exhibited the weapon, and asked for our opinion. "Do you like it?" "I'm not really a huge fan of guns," I replied. "Are you scared?" "Maybe." I tried my best to hide the fact that I was scared because I didn't want him to notice it and take advantage of me. Even my friend kept a fake smile on her face to keep up appearances. He quickly put it back in his pants and stared at us for a long time with a wary eye, after which he strangely asked, "What did you see?" I figured he was talking about the gun, but I couldn't understand why he would ask such a thing with such a suspicious tone. He asked again, so I said, "I didn't see anything," and he laughed. My answer may seem stupid, but I didn't want him to feel proud or to give him this kind of power over us by letting him know that we were afraid of that weapon. I thought it was stupid to carry a gun and to point it at his friend, but he just kept laughing, and his laugh sounded awful to my ears, like some cold-blooded sociopath laugh. I was so nervous that my hands started shaking. My friend must have noticed because all of a sudden she took my arm and told everybody, "Oh crap, we're late. We gotta go. Have a good day," before we started running away. They shouted after us, "Can we have your phone number at least?" And she replied without even looking back, "No, have a nice day anyway." We never walked so fast to get to class than that day, even though we ended up not attending the lecture because our teacher was sick and we hadn't known that. We were still so astounded by what had just happened that it took us several hours to process it all. After that, we avoided the park for a long period of time. So to the drunk, creepy guys at the park who had a gun for no reason, let's not meet again. Ever. I want to add something to this because it may be confusing. We had no idea who they were, what business they were in, or what kind of things they could do. We could only make assumptions because, well, some of them were casually carrying hard drugs, and this Manny had a gun. But one thing was sure, they all seemed pretty fucked up as human beings. We could have asked them why they had those things on them, but it felt too risky. We were 2 defenseless girls, and it felt safer to stay quiet about those delicate subjects. We also never told the police because we had no idea what proof of evidence we were supposed to give them. Screaming Ghost by Clarence. I was born and raised in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina hit the summer after my senior year of high school. This story takes place 2 Christmas Eves later, outside the swanky lakefront condo where I was currently living. And that was only because for a good while after Katrina, the whole city suffered from an epidemic of vacant luxury apartments. Those brave few of us who had come back early enough that you could still smell the inside of everyone's refrigerator when you drove down the street were able to live pretty much wherever we wanted for insanely cheap. Before the lakefront condo, I had been paying $200 a month to rent a 2-bedroom apartment on Magazine Street, which is currently going for 8 times that. I only moved to the lakefront condo because it was cheaper, if you can believe it. My mom was still living in Baton Rouge at this time, and my younger sister had wanted to see the extended family for Christmas, so she was crashing with me that night. Even though she was in her late teens by this point, it had been a rough past few years, and my mom wanted to surprise my sister with Christmas presents when she woke up in the morning. This is how I ended up spending most of that Christmas Eve night driving all the way to Baton Rouge and back, my trunk now full of wrapped presents, and my sister's dog May in the passenger seat, panting with anticipation. This was during the 2 whole weeks of winter we get here each year, and I remember it was cold enough that night that there was snow on the I-10. For a lifelong NOLA native, that sight alone was pretty surreal. I finally got back to the condo at about 3 a.m. and had parked out front instead of parking inside the garage to make it easier to unload the car. I called my girlfriend to confirm that my sister was asleep and was waiting for her to come down and take May so I could safely sneak the presents up. I wanted to save my girlfriend time and meet her at the entrance to the complex, so I clipped May's leash to her collar and we exited the car. We had just started toward the building when it happened. Now, you need to understand that May is one of the sweetest dogs ever. Whenever she sees literally anybody, her tail starts wagging because she knows there's at least an off chance she might get attention. I had never heard May growl for real until that moment, and it took me a second to realize it was even her making the noise. My gaze was on the building's entrance when the growling started, and I looked down just in time to see May stop dead in her tracks, and then hunch down so low her belly was almost touching the ground. She was looking at the vacant lot bordering the left side of the condo complex, and I reflexively turned to follow her line of sight. I saw a crying woman standing there, just beyond the corner of the building. She was in her 30s and had vaguely curly blonde hair. She was barefoot and wearing only a white t-shirt that was long enough to resemble a nightgown. The woman was sobbing, and normally, if I were to see a half-naked woman sobbing in the middle of the night, I'd like to think my first reaction would be to try to help her. But something about the sound of May's growl had sent a chill up my spine when I spotted the woman. I froze in place as alarm bells began to go off from what felt like the most primitive parts of my brain. And as soon as she saw me, we locked eyes, the woman let out the most blood-chilling scream I have ever heard. If you've seen that recent Ring camera footage of a car driving by someone's house with a possible female kidnapping victim in the passenger seat, this woman's scream sounded a lot like that. She pointed out the lake in front of her, behind me, as the scream seemed to go on forever. Even longer than you'd think someone could scream. And then she was gone. The woman didn't fade away. It wasn't even like I blinked and she vanished. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. Her scream cut off just as suddenly, but the sound of it was still ringing in my ears. About a week later, one of the maintenance men told me that before Katrina, a homeless couple with 2 kids used to live out of an old shed that had been abandoned on that vacant field between the complex and the neighboring building. Of course, they hadn't been since the hurricane, and like many of the city's homeless, were presumed dead. And of course, my description of the screaming woman matched the mother of this homeless family exactly, down to her slightly curly blonde hair and the long t-shirt she wore like a dress, which led me to conclude that she hadn't been pointing at the lake. She had been pointing at the floodwaters. My Security Job, submitted by Renee. I used to be a security guard for a major company in the early 2000s, and we had a contract with the local hospitals. I was posted to a psychiatric hospital on what they called the PIC unit. We had some pretty crazy moments in there. One time, we had a very pregnant 6-foot-and-big woman who would get extremely aggressive. So aggressive that they had to put her in an isolation room to stop from her harming herself or others. While in there, she started to use her bed as a battering ram, so we had to open the door and remove the bed and just put a mattress in the room. Shortly after that, she started to rip her clothes and pissed all over her clothing and started to smear it all over herself and the walls. Then she started to run and then drop-kick the floor with both feet. Again, we had to open the door, and she was trying to punch us and whipped her peed-soaked clothing at us with the other hand. We had to restrain her pee-soaked body and give her a sedative. That was probably the grossest thing I ever had to do. Things quieted down for a bit, and after a few hours of that incident, they gave me a pack of cigarettes, and I had to bring 10 low-risk patients outside for a smoke. My shift did not get any better. As I went out, 2 of the patients started to run for the road. I got on my radio and notified the nurses that we had 2 runners, and I wasn't too worried about them. There was only one road out, and I knew the police would probably catch them pretty quickly. All of a sudden, though, I had another male patient walk up to a tree and started climbing it. Again, I got on the radio and requested another security guard come to keep an eye on the remaining patients while I ran over to the guy climbing the tree. I asked him what was up there. He just looked at me and said that he was going to end it all. Then I had to get back on my radio and say we now had a code purple, and that meant we had a suicide situation. I asked the patient, "What about your family?" And he just responded, "Not enough room for them in the tree." "Fair enough," I said. I offered him a smoke and asked him to climb down and just hang out with me. Shoot the shit and see if we can figure something out. He just replied with a "fuck you" and started to put his hand over his head like he was diving into a pool. I quickly told him, "Dude, you're not going to die. You're not high up enough, and the ground is soft." I pointed out that he was on a hospital ground crawling full of doctors and nurses, and said his odds of dying were slim to none. Again, he just looked at me. I said, "Buddy, you're not going to die. Best case scenario is you get a broken leg or an ankle, or worst case scenario is you break your neck and become a quadriplegic. You think your life sucks now? Wait till you're eating your meals out of a straw and have to wait for someone to wipe your ass." He looked at me and said, "I won't die if I jump?" And I just replied, "No, you won't. People jump from higher buildings onto concrete and live. You're jumping onto grass. So just climb down, I'll give you another smoke, and we'll figure this out." I got all cocky as he went back to the trunk and grabbed it. I thought, I just talked this man down and thought my logic was foolproof. People study for years for this stuff, and I, with little training, managed to stop this man from hurting himself. Boy, was I wrong. He started to climb higher. Just then a nurse arrived and asked him what he was doing, and he replied, "Climbing higher. The security guard told me it wasn't high enough to kill myself where I was." I got a glaring look from the nurse, and she told me to go to my floor and said she would deal with me later. I went back inside and made the most detailed report in my life. The man had climbed in the tree around 8 p.m. When my shift ended at 12 a.m., I was leaving the grounds, and he was still up in the tree. 2 police cars, 1 ambulance, and 1 fire truck were all there, along with him in a huge cloud of mosquitoes. I figured if that guy died, it would be from being eaten alive by the insects. I have no clue how long that man was in the tree or how it ended. The next day, I took my uniform and dropped it off at the office and told them I was done. Plus, I had just had another job interview and got accepted for a higher-paying job for an outfitting company for camping and fishing. The Dog, submitted by Marcus. When I was 11, my parents were going to see my grandmother for an afternoon, but I didn't want to go. I faked an illness to get out of it. I loved my grandmother, but the thought of spending an entire day at her apartment in her elder community was horrifying. My mom bought it, and as soon as they left, I ran downstairs and started playing my Sega. After an hour or so, I decided to go outside for a bit. I've got to describe my yard. All of my neighbors had fences, but we didn't. So on the left side and right sides, fence. All the way at the back, after a thin line of trees, more fence. I hope that makes sense. So I grabbed a styrofoam glider from our shed and was shooting it all around the yard, making loops and just having fun that kids seem to have on their own. After about a half hour, I remember having a strange feeling like something was wrong. I turned around and saw that a dog had come into the yard from around the side of our house where there was a gap between and no fence or gate. I had been begging my parents to get me a dog for years, but they said I wasn't old enough to handle it until recently when they said they would for my birthday. So anytime I saw a dog, I got excited and wanted to pet it and play with it. This was weird, though. The dog, a yellow lab, just stood there looking at me. It looked off balance for a minute, and as I walked over, I could see it was drooling a ton, and it just didn't look right. I said something like, "Hi, doggy, where did you come from?" And it stopped its slow walking and looked at me, and then started snapping and biting at the air. I distinctly remember that because there was drool flying through the air, and also, again remembering, something was not right. The dog kept kind of stumbling around and then just laid down, and I yelled out if anyone could hear me. Nobody was outside, but there was the sound of a lawnmower somewhere a few doors down. There's no way they could hear me. I slowly walked over to the dog, but not too close, and when he saw me, he jumped up and started snapping again. Even not having a dog, again, I knew something was very, very wrong. The dog was now slowly moving back and forth and blocking my way back into my house. Not like it knew it was doing that, but that was just what was happening. Anytime I tried to make a move to get back inside, it would move in that direction, and I gotta be honest, I was getting pretty scared. Finally, it made a quick stumbling move toward me, and I ran and climbed the chain-link fence and fell into my neighbor's yard. I was screaming help by now, and the dog had lumbered over to the fence and was looking at me, still drooling. Had I seen the movie Cujo, I probably would have figured it out, but I just knew that this was not a dog I could play with. I ran to my neighbor's back door, yelling, and Mr. George opened it up and asked what was wrong. I told him, and he looked up and then brought me inside and got me a Freezy Pop while he called the SPCA. He kept an eye on the dog while I looked on, and finally the people came out and got the dog. I felt so bad I started crying as they got one of those loops around his neck and started slowly pulling him into a van. When Mr. George told me it was probably rabies, I knew the dog was going to be put down. At the end of everything, I got more than a stern talking to about lying about my illness, but I also got a lesson in what can go wrong if you don't take care of your dog. This dog had no collar and no tags, and we never found out where he came from. Popcorn Man, submitted by A Light at Night. Back in the early 90s, I worked at a local campground selling popcorn in a stand down a little dirt road from the camp's general store. There were 4 of us that split shifts, afternoon versus evenings, Thursdays through Sundays. We flip-flopped as best we could so that we all could have lives outside of the place, you know. It was an easy operation. Just take people's orders, dump oil and corn in the kettles, let it pop, then bag it up. It was a very popular spot in the evenings as people wanted snacks for their campfires, and we made plain, caramel with cashews, cheddar, and so on. It was an easy and really fun job for a bunch of 16-year-olds, with little to no supervision outside of a casual check-in on either afternoon or evening shift, and then the evening close. We had a lot of fun. One night, I was working with my friend Dana when it began to rain pretty hard, and soon after came the thunder. The stand was more of a small building with a counter outside, and 2 separate large windows for people to order. Behind that, there was an area where we kept all of our supplies in stock. It was getting close to shutdown time, and no one was coming around, so we decided to start cleaning up. Then we heard a voice say, "How much for a large bag?" I popped up from where I was sweeping up some stuff off the floor and looked out into the dark and rain. There was no one there, and I asked Dana if she had heard that too. She came from the back room and said, "Yeah, can't he read the sign?" And we both laughed. Maybe it was just someone walking by, I said, and we kept cleaning up. The rain was still pouring, and it was cascading off the little overhang in front of the stand. And the only light outside of our white Christmas lights lining the roof and windows of the stand was the brighter light over the door of the general store. The old rotary phone that was in there rang, and it was the owner saying to just tally things up and leave it in the hidden lockbox. He'd get it tomorrow rather than come out in the storm. I looked at Dana and said, the minute the rain slows up, let's shut the windows, douse the lights, and get over to your car at the GS. As soon as I said that other voice came again, this time a little farther away, like a shout. How much for a large bag? We both looked out the front windows, and we saw a figure standing in the rain a little ways up the road to the GS, and we could just see the silhouette with the bright light of the store behind him or her. We later just decided it was a him because of the voice. Sorry, we're closed, but in the future it's $2.50 for a large. Come back tomorrow, we'll make you up some, yelled out Dana. The figure just stood there and did nothing. I mean, whatever. If the goof wants to stand in the rain, that's his business. We finished up our work and were waiting for a break in the rain when I went back out to the front to close the windows. The figure was still standing there with the water coming down, and he wasn't moving a muscle. I whispered to Dana to come and look, and when she did, we both got creeped out. We shut the windows and went into the back room. Dana opened her purse and got out 2 Virginia Slims. I mean, we weren't supposed to smoke there, and really we weren't supposed to be smoking at all, but we were really weirded out by what was going on and needed to calm down. I snuck back to one of the front windows, cracked it a bit, and whoever it was still there, staring at the popcorn stand. I latched the window and said we should call our boss, and we did, but he didn't answer. Perfect. The rain let up finally, and we opened the back door. Dana went around the side and said, "Okay, he's not there." We locked up, ran to her car, and went straight home. We never saw him anywhere outside of the stand or the general store. 2 days later, we were on the day shift, which was noon to 5. We didn't tell our friends about the weird guy from the other night, and we figured maybe they'd see him too. We just got into our fun banter with the campers and families. Right around 4, things always seemed to slow down as people started eating dinner, so we had a lull in the action, and were just talking about boys and what school was going to be like now that we were juniors. I was yammering on about something stupid, I'm sure, when I noticed Dana looking over my shoulder. I turned around, and there, in the same spot as the other night, was a guy standing looking at us. He was about 30 yards away, so we couldn't get a good look at him, but he was in the exact same spot. "How much for a large bag?" he called out. And it was then that a little kid came running from the GS and ran right through the guy. Through him. The kid knew something was wrong too, because as soon as he ran through the figure, he stopped and looked back at where he had just come from. I mean, it was freaky. Right as that happened, the figure turned, walked across the road through a campsite and into the trees. And it never came back. The little boy looked at us, and I yelled out to him, "Who was that?" And in his little voice said, "Who was who?" And then he shrugged and kept on running to wherever he was going. Dana and I looked at one another, and I knew she was not going to say a word about any of this to anyone, and neither was I. We never did, until now. I never did, until now. Being a Girl on World of Warcraft by Cat Religion. As a female who's been on the game for 15 years now, I've met a load of creeps, but only a few who made me feel unsafe. To start off, I've always had a laptop since I was in high school, a luxury back then that I worked hard enough to earn to buy one. My mom almost took my money I earned for drugs, but luckily money I had made in tips were in cash, so it was easier to hide it from her. At first my mom was mad I bought myself a laptop, but she soon forgot everything. My dad couldn't have cared less, and my older brother already had his own. So I started playing WoW with him at 14, and back then girls were unheard of. So I got the usual creeps who usually backed off after hearing my age or they were young too. But not this one guy. This guy loved that I was underage. I was about 16 and used to creepy guys at this point. No longer a noob at the game or fending off the creeps, it was no surprise a new guy in the guild started hitting on me. Now, I was 16. Dumb, young, horny, and stupid, but I knew I wasn't going to find love on WoW where you knew no one in real life. Plus, I had the ultimate crush on a guy I couldn't have because he was my brother's best friend. But in my mind back then, I only wanted him. so it was easy to turn guys down despite being desperate as hell for one guy. But that all changed after my brother's friend went off to college. I had a part-time job with my brother's friend, but girls at work surrounded him and I became demoralized. I'd never find love. Cue 19-year-old guy on WoW who made me feel wanted. I had a camera phone so I could send and post pictures at that age, and back then I mostly used Facebook, MySpace, and PhotoBucket. I lost a lot of weight my sophomore year, so I confidently posted bikini pics and sexy pictures, thinking I'd lure the attention of my brother's friend who was 19. So when this guy who was also 19 liked me, it didn't faze me. He looked the part in his photos, and his younger brother was my age. So I thought. He was extremely attractive in his photos, and even proved it was him in his pictures by holding items I asked for. He started paying for my WoW subscription, which in the long run I realized was just to get my home address and real name. I was so stupid and heartbroken over my brother's friend. Years of teaching myself online safety and the ability to be strong against flirts was all but lost in the fog. We'd talk for hours on Ventrilo, and he'd make me feel pretty. I was completely blinded by this point. He sent me gifts, and I didn't even question how he had my address. Then he offered to drive and pick me up. Only then did I suddenly get cold feet. I had a good friend on WoW, someone my brother met at PAX and joined the guild, and is still one of my best friends to this day, though we both aren't fond of my older brother. He's 6 years older than me, but never creeped on me, and he was more like the protective brother I lacked. Well, at least till I was 24 and single for the first time did we hook up, but that's because we were friends for so long, but the distance led it to not turning into a relationship. He caught on to things through my conversation, and was my words of wisdom in a time I was lacking any of my own. He saw something was fishy when I couldn't. I told my friend I was scared to meet him because, dumb teenager logic, I thought he wouldn't like me. My friend chimed in that I shouldn't meet anyone off the internet my age. I told him about the gifts, and I swear I've never been scolded like this in my life, not even by my own parents, but he always cared like that. He wondered why I gave my address to someone I'd never met, and the expensive gifts I got were not something the average 19-year-old could afford. None of that ever clicked for me, of course, because I was lonely and trying to prove myself. I had a crush, and I just wanted to get a boyfriend. Like I told the guy, it wasn't wise to meet in person, and my parents said I wasn't allowed to. And that's when it went dark. At first it was pestering over and over, guilting me over the gifts he gave me and encouraging me to defy my parents. And while he kept bothering me, it never once occurred to me he'd lose his shit. My good friend was worried shitless about this guy having my address, and he went as far as to drive 11 hours to my house and explain the situation to my dad, as I refused to tell him out of fear of getting in trouble at the time. This was all the while he was taking his spring break in my state instead of his own with his friends. I mean, there's a reason he's still one of my best friends. He has a little sister of his own as well. She's my age, so his protective nature is natural. Eventually, he made me block the guy, and that was that. This guy was pissed off. He'd go on different accounts to accuse me of gold digging and using him. Luckily, my good friend was smart enough and had the foresight to change my WoW password and even paid for my account for me taking this guy off it entirely, as one of the guy's threats to me was he was going to delete my account. But it didn't end there. It got worse, as he'd consistently find ways to message me and tell me how horrible I was, until about a month had passed. I was walking home from school, about a 2-mile walk in a wealthy suburb of New England. I'd done it for years. I mean, many kids did it, as it was a very safe town with no crime in it, or crime in the surrounding towns. Without a second thought, I took off with my 100-pound backpack, maybe overestimating it a lot, but I put my headphones on and started my 20-minute walk home. It was so cold, so I had earmuffs over my headphones only, drowning out sound more too. I swear, if I could talk to myself as a kid, I probably would just slap myself for stupidity. Because WoW Guy knew I walked home every day, as I talked about it. He knew my address, and I never thought twice about anything. I was on the back roads walking home, and honestly it would be easy for anyone to map my school to my home. It was a pretty straightforward walk with only one turn. Halfway home, it was between songs, when I heard a vague crunching sound of tires rolling over gravel on the road slowly. I turned around to see a tinted black car that you couldn't see much of the person in front. I jogged out of the driveway I was standing in, assuming he was waiting his turn to turn in. But he didn't turn in. The roads were dead, and it didn't make sense for him to not go around. I swear, the saying that you go cold when you're terrified is absolutely true. It could have been a summer day at 95 degrees, and my bones would have been cold. My heart just sank, and my breathing was uncomfortable. I felt like I had no control over my body as I realized this guy was following me. And my blood truly ran cold, and my hands shook as tears formed and my skin felt tight. My body felt like it wasn't ready to fight or flight, but simply freeze and die. It only got worse as the second I turned my head to see the car stop, I stopped. My world stopped. I couldn't stop staring. I just froze and breathed like all my school books were on my chest. Crying silently, my eyes hurt, no tears or sound, as I just stood there. The door opened after what felt like hours, but only seconds, maybe a minute. And it was, in fact, him. It was the attractive guy from the photos. Not a catfish, but something seemed different. At first I thought it was his angry expression, but soon realized he was definitely not 19, more like 30 plus. I could barely think over the loud sound of my heart racing as it froze me in place. I thought I was going to throw up as he spoke to me, told me to get in the car or he'd light my house on fire and kill my dog in front of me. I honestly just couldn't move. Couldn't reach for my phone as his words just froze me. And like some magic, we both failed to notice the little old lady on her porch watching this play out. Suddenly I heard her yell, "Get away from that girl right now before I burn you alive!" We both turned to meet her eyes. A pissed-off small lady, about 60 or 70 years old with white hair. I think she noticed my frozen fear state as she told me to get over to her quickly. And like that, I ran over to her, tossing off my heavy brick of a backpack. It was obvious he was unsure what to do next, as he just stood there and watched me run to her. It must have been the sight of this thin little old lady standing in front of a teenage girl yelling at this man to go away. And like that, Savior number 2 joined the battle as her husband stepped out, a guy who looked like he'd been through a war or two, with a shotgun of all things in his hand and a booming voice, gun pointed, saying, "I've shot and killed men for less reason. You better leave now." He got into his car and drove off as I simply collapsed. All that fear just came out as I cried harder and harder as my brain sifted through the past few months of mistakes. After calming me down enough to speak in non-hyperventilating words, the woman asked me if I knew him. I told her kind of, but only online from a video game, not real life. Of course, explaining it wasn't easy, and her husband couldn't grasp why I'd want to print I was at war. I'm sure in his experience he was thinking Call of Duty, not magical creatures in a game called World of Warcraft. The woman got on the phone with the school counselor. It was her daughter, apparently, and she told her my name. I was well known to her daughter, ironically, but there were only 250 or less kids in the school, and the town itself was small. Many staff at our school had families in town, and kids at school they were related to either by their own children or their siblings' children. It was the kind of town if you didn't leave by a certain age, you were stuck there. So honestly, it seemed ironic, but entirely not a huge surprise. The counselor was well aware of my family and my mom's drug addiction, as child services had been involved a few times. She came by in 10 minutes to pick me up, and asked me a ton of questions, of course knowing I didn't want to involve the police, as I was scared of being taken away from my parents again. FYI, foster care was worse than a drugged-out mom on prescriptions. We weren't rich, but we were more well-off than many. Though my mom worked, my dad kept my mom on a tight budget to keep her from buying prescriptions from Canada she wasn't prescribed, hence her taking my money. The counselor knew all of this, and knew I was better off there than foster care, which was a gamble with losing odds at best. Plus, in 2 more years I'd be off to college anyway. So we didn't involve the cops, but she made me promise to take the bus every day, and to inform my dad of the situation. She also called my dad at work to inform him, and had a teacher make sure I got on the bus every day till I graduated even. I mean, it really sucked, but I understood. If it ended there, it would be nice, but there's still a bit more, and I'm sorry for the length and grammar of this. It's late at night, and I'm recalling from memory and typing on my phone. 2 days after this, my dad had to fly away for business. My brother was off at college, so it left me and my high mom, who promised my dad she would stay sober while he was gone, but I was used to helping her while she was high. It was kind of like taking care of a child. But I was on edge in that big house from the 60s. My cat stirred at night, and dogs barking outside set me on edge. I barely slept. My good friend from WoW called every night making sure I was okay for the past month. I lived out in the middle of the woods next to a huge river in my backyard, so there was still a lot of wildlife outside in the dead silence of cold months. I had been used to all the bumps in the night, the cats coming and going and the dog barking at every animal in the yard, but it all seemed new to me as I lay in bed trying to drown out my fears. The house I grew up in was a 6-bedroom house, and I had a little sister too, but she stayed with my grandma in another state per court order, while I was allowed to choose due to her only being 9 and I was 16. The other rooms were used as a game room, an office for my dad, and a guest room, which was usually used mostly by my grandmother when she visited with my sister. It was scary to be out there alone in the middle of the woods, because my mom was basically defenseless. I was letting my cats inside for the night, and 5, who all knew to come in at night for dinner and stayed in till morning. At the end of the long driveway between my neighbor and our house was a black car that night. When I saw it, I quickly shut the door and locked it after my cat got inside. I made sure all 5 doors were locked and even put cardboard on the glass doors to the pool, hoping if he broke them, it would delay him, if in fact it was his car and that was him. I went and turned off the lights, got all my cats into one room so I knew they were safe. Here's the thing about my dog. He's untrained for the most part, but was basically a giant lab puppy in his mind. But he growled at strangers and barked at animals he didn't like. We had to keep him outside if we had guests, but he never bit anyone, and if you spent enough time around him, he'd eventually accept you. Also, he didn't growl at all strangers, so he wasn't the most reliable guard dog either. But he was big and had a deep bark. I mulled over what to do as I sat there in the dark with my dog, waiting for the shadow to pass by the window. I eventually went upstairs to my mom's room and woke her up from her sleeping pill slumber. Groggy and still kind of high, she didn't quite grasp what I was telling her till I started crying. She sort of sobered up and asked me to get her some coffee, and I did. All the while I was watching my dog's every move because I knew he could sense something even before I did. As my mom sobered, the fear in her eyes grew. Eventually, she got the idea to call my neighbors and ask them if they recognized the car. After they all said no, 2 of the men went outside of their house to check the car together. The car wasn't empty, but at closer inspection, they noticed it was a newer Lexus, and in the passenger seat was a laptop. The car was locked, but with a flashlight they could see somewhat into the tinted windows. They never told us why, but something they saw in the car prompted them to call the local sheriff. We only had one, and he lived out of town. We were too small to have a police department, and he drove over about 15 minutes later, ran the plates, and asked the houses around about the car. Apparently, it was a rental from Ohio, and he was calling to see who was renting it, but the offices were closed. He stuck around in his car for about an hour till someone came out of the woods and then ran back in as the cop turned his spotlight on him. I couldn't see what he was pointing at with his light as it was on the side of my house and I was looking at the front. I guess he called for backup as 3 other cars showed up in about 5 minutes from the neighboring town highway patrol. This is when a lady cop got out, and I asked to speak with her. I was pretty shy back then, but something about a female cop made me feel more comfortable to open up with. I told her the gist of the story, and then she called my counselor who backed up my story, but also explained why I was scared of cops because of my history with foster care and not wanting to go back there. This is when a mostly sober mom joined me, hugging me, doing her typical apologetic routine, but also offering much-needed comfort as she called my dad, too. Eventually, the lady cop asked if she could take a look around the house to see if things were secure and get any other information from my laptop about this guy. In her search, she found something I didn't think about checking. The basement door was not just unlocked, but open. It's never unlocked, so I didn't even think to check it as our backyard floods in the spring due to the beaver dams, and it's got extra seals and stuff to prevent the basement from flooding. But the stuff sealing it, and sandbags and stuff, were set aside. The door at the bottom of the stairs was locked still, though it had some damage like someone had tried picking it. But whoever had been there had access to half the basement that was storage. The basement was sectioned and the other half used to be used for my brother's parties. The door between the sections was like a front door, not an indoor door, as in the summer my dad felt the hatch open to dry out the basement and adjust pool settings, as it was basically the pool house, and the cats loved it. The section that led upstairs was locked from the inside, and the wall and doors were not drywall and cheap doors, but lock and key heavy doors, and the wall was brick. Upon my dad confirming that he had not left the door open, my suspicions that the black car was this guy's, that was pretty much confirmed. As we walked through the house to make sure everything was still safe, the lady cop got on my laptop and the other cops were searching the woods. I gave her everything I had. This guy's photos, his username. She even checked to see if his credit card was still on my account, but it wasn't. But the last few digits were. She then asked to take my laptop for a few days as she thought she could get some good evidence from it. I just asked her to please not damage it and return it as soon as possible because I used it a lot. Before smartphones, it was all I had. After a few hours, the onlooking neighbors had gone to bed. The cops came back empty-handed, but they left a cop outside our house and towed the guy's car. From what the lady cop told me, in the car there were 2 guns, some sort of rope and handcuffs, and the guy who ran back into the dense woods was wearing a winter ski mask. It wasn't out of season, but still suspicious nonetheless. Eventually I tried to lay down and go to sleep, but I was pretty sure I was going to call out sick tomorrow and kept all my cats inside for the day. I was too restless to sleep. Every sound made me so scared. My mom slept with the dog in her room. I'm very allergic to animals, but less to cats, as I kind of built up a tolerance. And my cat slept in my room most nights as choice, as my room was usually the warmest. At 3:30 a.m., I heard a knock at the back door, and a guy said, "Undercover police officer, open up." I was still awake as I walked downstairs to make out a guy standing in the dark with a gun. As he saw me, he demanded I let him in now, as he needed to speak with me. Something felt off. My gut knew it before I did that this guy's voice seemed forced, like someone purposely making their voice deeper. And why was he at the back door? So I turned on a light outside, and sure enough, it was the World of Warcraft guy. I just screamed, and as quickly as I screamed, he started hitting the door hard. It wasn't a very loud horror movie scream, but more like a gasp scream. I don't think the fear in my body had a loud scream to let out, but the banging was pretty loud as I ran to the front to see if the officer was still outside. He was, but he wasn't getting out of his car. I didn't want to run outside as I'm not a fast runner, so I turned the porch lights on and off a couple of times, but still nothing. After a minute, my dog came bolting down to the door, barking and growling, nearly foaming at the mouth. Soon my mom followed and yelled out that she had a gun. She didn't, but a bluff is a bluff. Somehow during all of this, the cop outside had snuck around back and finally had his gun pointed at this guy, yelling at him to put his gun down. I hid as the rest went down, but he was arrested. No trial needed me to attend, and my statement was enough. Come to find out, he wasn't even American. The car was rented under his friend's name, and after all was done, he was deported back to Canada. I assumed something with his passport would prevent him from coming back to the USA, as the cop reassured me that he wouldn't be able to come back. I don't know what exactly he was charged with, but I think my dad said aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and something else. Also, it turned out he was 32 years old and not 19, so I assume me being a minor also carried a charge. Well, life moved on from there. I've had plenty of creeps before and after, but he was by far the worst from World of Warcraft. I had a couple from streaming, but I was an adult and much better staying safe online. Only one worse than this guy was my ex-boyfriend's cousin who made my life hell for a couple of years. But that's another story, for another time. Not My Mother, by Meows and Boo. So this story happened about 11 years ago. I was a senior in high school at the time, but this is the single most mind-boggling thing that I have ever experienced. It's also important to note that it happened mid-December. I'm from Iowa, And the winters here get cold at night, like if you get stuck outside, you will die kind of cold. That plus the snowfall makes everything dead silent. I mean, you can hear everything and anything inside the house and even immediately outside of it. Well, me and my best friend were hanging out in my family's walkout basement, just having a boring winter night playing video games. We were also the only ones home. The reason it was just us is because my mother went from work straight to a bar to grab a few drinks with coworkers. So me and my friend thought it would be a good idea to break into the family wine and live a little. As we were sitting there opening up the first bottle, I heard the door to the garage open and slam shut. I immediately went, "Oh shit," and started looking for places to hide the bottle. My friend then said, "I thought your mom was supposed to be out all night." "She is," I replied. I then heard a few heavy stomps and my mother yell out, "Meows'n Boo, anyone home?" I yelled back up the stairs, "Yep, just hanging out in the basement." I heard a few more steps move from the garage door towards the stairs, and she yelled out again, "Can you come help me with something? I need you up here." I replied back while frantically trying to find a good place to hide the wine bottle, "Yep, give me a minute." Then there was silence for about 20 seconds. "Anyone down there with you?" she yelled back in a more concerned, serious tone, in a voice that was slightly off of my mother's. This was the first thing that told me something wasn't right. Our family never cared if anyone was over, as our house was a very open house to all family and friends. And the voice was just wrong. Like it sounded like my mother's, but it was missing something that I couldn't put my finger on. Weirded out, I replied back, "Just Colton." After I yelled back to her, I found a good place to stash the bottle and began walking up the steps to the next level. Now, as I was walking up the steps, I couldn't help but feel the overbearing silence of the house and this slight electric twinge that something wasn't right. When I got to the top of the steps, I looked over to where the door to the garage was, and also the kitchen right next to it. And it was black, pitch black. All the lights were off, and there was no moonlight shining through any windows. I walked over to the kitchen yelling out, "Mom, where are you?" There was no reply, just silence and darkness. I felt that electric twinge turn into full needles, and my adrenaline kicked in full force. I had to get out of there as fast as possible. My mother was not home. I ran back down the stairs, grabbing my coat along the way. "What's wrong?" Colton says. "My mom's not home," I replied as fast as I could, looking for my truck keys. "What do you mean? You were just talking with her." I could see the look of confusion on his face. I just looked at him and said, "There's no one home. We need to leave now." I took a few steps towards the back door that opened up to the yard, and then I saw my dog shaking on the couch and my cat growling behind it. I couldn't leave them. I just knew that if we left, something would happen. "Are we leaving?" Colton said, still confused as all hell. "No, I can't leave them here alone. Something's really off. I'm going to call my mom and figure this out." I took out my phone and called my mom, and she picked up immediately. "Meows'n Boo? What's going on?" "Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling for me from the second level, and when I went up there, you weren't there." I said it frantically, hoping that she was playing a joke. "No, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay? What do you mean you heard me?" I filled her in on the whole story, and she rushed home. Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she got there. But before she did, we could hear something upstairs. Not walking or sitting on things, but it was more of like pressure in the air, like a black hole was slowly moving from one room to the next. And the word that I would instinctively use to describe it is hungry. When my mom got home, you could feel the thing leave just as quick as it came, like an overbearing predatory presence had just flown away. We still have never figured out what the hell was going on, and this is just one story of many unexplainable things that have happened to us. But this is easiest to write down, and one that I was happy to have a witness to. My mother has passed away now, and I've moved away to Arizona, but whenever I go back to Iowa and I see Colton, he still gets creeped out by what happened. I will never truly know what happened, but I know that whatever it was that had my mother's voice, it was evil, and it was hungry. Disgusting Discovery, submitted by Big Mike G. One time when I was around 13, me and my friends were at our local ball field throwing a baseball around and shagging flies. There were 4 of us total: Ken, Dan, Randy, and me. The field was at a town park, and the outfield butted up against some forest land. There was a small fence before it, and then some grass, and then the trees. We were taking turns knocking up pop flies to each other as the evening wore on. It sounds kind of funny now, but we all practiced all the time that summer outside of Little League. We were all convinced we'd skip JV and go straight to the varsity team. Yeah, right. We were all 120 pounds soaking wet with a bushel of baseballs on our head. Anyway, we still had fun doing it. It was starting to get a little dark out, maybe around 8:30, but there was still enough light to play. Randy started really trying to belt it, and finally knocked one past the fence into the trees. He did it again, and I told him I wasn't going to get those flies, he'd have to do it. I mean, honestly, it was pissing us off. So he took his bat and walked over to the little fence, climbed over it, and then headed into the trees where he had hit the balls. We all just stood around talking, thinking we were done for the night. And that's when we heard him yell out, Guys! Guys, get over here! We turned to see him standing at the edge of the woods and waving for us to come over. We trotted over, jumped the fence, and he was really worked up and had a scared look on his face. When we asked what was up, he just said, This is so effing gross, man, I almost puked. We followed him into the trees, and maybe 10 feet in, there was a little clearing, maybe 8 feet around. Inside the circle was a bunch of dead animals, and by dead, I mean their heads were gone, and some of their paws were too. There were raccoons, squirrels, skunks, some cats, and 1 dog, and there were flies all over the place. We all took off back to the ball field. Dan asked out loud, What the hell was that? I mean, those weren't killed by another animal, no way. We all agreed. I mean, the heads were taken right off, and everything was just in this messy, neat pile. I went back for another look. The guys all stayed there. I mean, there was no rhyme or reason about it. Just a bunch of random animals with their heads pulled off. Their heads weren't there either. Those were totally missing. We decided to get out of there and ran to the cop station. Dan's uncle was a cop. He wasn't there, but we told the guy at the desk what we had found, and he thought we were putting him on. He said to stay there, and he radioed a call out to the ball field. We all stood around waiting impatiently, and finally the guy called back and said we weren't making it up, but it was probably just a fox or something that did it. He was getting animal control to take care of it. The desk cop told us to take off and thanked us for letting them know. We talked about it all the way back to our neighborhood before splitting up for our homes. Most of the conversation was, there's no way that a fox did that. A couple of days later, Dan saw his uncle and asked him if he had heard about it, and he said yes, and that the guys told him that we'd let the cops know. Dan told him, There's no way a fox did that. And his uncle said, Who said anything about a fox? I was told it was definitely the work of a person. I guess the cops didn't want us to be scared or something and made up the fox line. So our hunch was right all along. Dan told us that, and we all got quiet. I mean, what kind of screwball was in our neighborhood doing that to animals, and right near a park, for God's sake? We stopped hanging out there in the evenings because it was just too creepy. I'll never forget that pile of animals as long as I live, and I won't ever forget that someone with a screw loose did that. My Grandmother, submitted by Anonymous. This is more mildly creepy than scary, but if this is a coincidence, it sure is a hell of one. At Christmas 2011, my sisters and I paid a visit to my grandmother in her nursing home. She was suffering from late-stage dementia and was lucid a lot less those days. She recognized me immediately, and we all chatted for a bit, and things were going good. I finally told her I was pregnant and due July 24th, and she perked up and said, I am tickled pink about that. She did mention a couple of times that she was excited to meet the baby, who I shortly had found out was a girl. I was very sick with morning sickness, so sick that I lost 35 pounds, and I had not had a chance to see my grandmother after that. Before I knew it, it was my induction date, exactly a week after my due date, July 30th, 2012. I knew my grandmother had gotten worse and wasn't expected to live much longer, and I thought if she just hangs on a few more days, she'll get to meet the baby. My parents were in the hospital with her while I was being induced. My dad called to me to tell me that he didn't think she'd be making it through the night. I was not progressing in my labor fast, and about 2:05 a.m., July 31st, my water finally broke, and with that came a massive amount of pain. The epidural had to be done twice because of wrong placement. I was still in a lot of pain, and the nurses started to panic because my labor was progressing extremely fast at that point. I was given medication to slow contractions, and that did nothing. My dad had called a few times during all of this, which I wasn't able to answer, and when I finally did, he said, "I just want to let you know, she's gone." I asked, "When?" And he said, "It was 2:05. I'm not a big believer in spirituality and that sort of thing, but I can't help to think maybe she passed my daughter at some point and said, 'Go now.'" I had an emergency cesarean at 9:05 that day, and I got out of the hospital just in time to attend my grandmother's funeral. Several people stopped me to say my daughter was a blessed baby. I'm sad that I didn't have closure with her, but I cannot ignore the feeling that my grandmother somehow knew my daughter. Terrifying Walk, submitted by Karen with a C. When I was in my early 20s, I was still living at home and working an entry-level job, trying to save money to get my own place. I was and am kind of a loner. Not all the time, but let's just say I like my space. Back then, I would get sick of the noise of my family and go for really long walks around my village. There was a small park a couple of miles away from my street, and I would throw on my Walkman and play tapes and go for my walks. I always stayed in light and didn't wander off the beaten path as a rule, but on this occasion, I felt I had to. It was a warm spring day, a little after 6 p.m., when I finished dinner and made my way out the door. I was probably listening to Bon Jovi or something like that, just enjoying the fresh air as I walked along the sidewalks that led to the park. When I got to the park, there were people playing basketball and a few guys playing sand volleyball. There were other people milling around too, and most of them looking like they were heading home. It was just getting dusky. That's when I noticed a gray 4-door Jeep drive slowly by me. I didn't think a lot of it right then, but as I continued to walk along following the road on the shoulder, it came back in the other direction, and I recognized it as the one that had just gone by me a few minutes earlier. So what? Just somebody out for a drive in the park. I made a big loop around the park as there are lots of roads that crisscross between the main drag. I figured it would be dark when I got back to the street, and I wanted to be under the streetlights for the rest of my walk back home. I turned around and was still enjoying my music in the night. The volleyball players and basketball players were gone, but people were still out on bikes and would ride by me occasionally. I saw the same Jeep parked on the opposite side of the road I was on, and I had to pass by it. For whatever reason, I started to feel uneasy and also had that notion of someone watching me. I don't know why, but I said the idea in the back of my head that something was wrong. So I bucked off the road through a little ditch and continued walking closer to the trees a little off the main road, but still in the same direction. I got past the Jeep and breathed a sigh of relief and looked back to see if it was still there. It was, but when I turned around, there was a man standing in front of me, literally 6 feet away. He raised his hand to say hi and said, "My name's Jerry. What's yours?" I stopped walking and froze as all those feelings I just had come flooding back with a rage. This was not right. This was bad. I just said, "Hello," and kept walking, but moved back down into the ditch to get back to the road. Before I knew it, this guy ran down into the ditch and tackled me. No warning, no nothing. I was beyond terrified. I tried to scream, but was so in shock that nothing came out. When I finally yelled out, "What the hell are you doing?" he slapped me in the face again and again and told me to shut up. Now it was right before full dark was falling, and I knew there wouldn't be a lot of people in the park. Maybe the rangers would come around, but I was in serious trouble and I knew it. I tried to yell for him to stop, and this time he put one hand around my neck and started to choke me, while his other hand started to try to lift up my sweatshirt to get to my tights. I could barely breathe, and he just kept saying, "Shut up, shut up, shut up," and he was breathing very heavily. He was trying to put his hand into my pants, and I looked up from the ditch to the sky. On the road going by was a middle-aged couple on their bicycles. I locked eyes with both of them as they stared down. I mean, they could see my legs flailing, my hand hitting the back of this guy, and had to have seen that he was choking me and obviously trying to rape me. But they didn't stop. They just kept riding. The guy was becoming even more aggressive. He finally let go of my throat and literally punched me in the eye. It hurt so bad, and I was trying to breathe, that all I could do was suck air and see stars. I thought to myself, this is it. You're going to get raped and probably murdered. After this happened, a few months later, someone told me that I should have remained positive, and I remember looking at that woman directly in the face and said, "Have you ever been in this position?" And she said, "No, but I know many people who have." And I said, "That doesn't mean anything. Until you're there, keep your thoughts to yourself." Sorry for the sidebar. But something amazing happened right then. Apparently 2 of the volleyball players had left something behind and happened to be coming by and saw what was up. One of them ran down and literally knocked this guy off of me. He began punching the heck out of him while the other guy asked if I was okay, and I could barely muster a response, but sort of nodded. He ran to his car to get the sheriff. The creep broke away from the volleyball player and managed to run back to his Jeep and get in and tear out of the park. The volleyball player, whose name I'm not going to mention, chatted with me without touching me or anything, and he thought that it would freak me out, I'm sure. But I told him over and over how happy I was and how thankful I was, although I was crying the entire time. He just kept saying, "You need to have yourself looked at, and you're bleeding." A few minutes later, we heard police sirens, and not only were the park rangers coming out, but also the local sheriff. I told them everything that happened over and over, described the gray 4-door Jeep as best I could, and gave them the best description of the guy, but to be honest, in my terror, I lost a lot of details. To make this a little shorter, I had to go to the hospital and get checked out, and ended up staying there overnight because I was completely hysterical. I didn't go to school for over a week, totally afraid to go outside. My friends came over to comfort me, and I do remember my teachers waiving all my assignments and tests. 2 things I want to leave everyone with. If you see something wrong happening, please do something about it. I'm not saying that you have to get involved physically, but do what you can to help someone else out, even if it's yelling that you see what's going on to scare someone off. And it doesn't have to be what happened to me. I mean, I don't care what it is. It could be someone going through a neighbor's mail. Second, if you do see something happening like those older people did and just went on with your night and say nothing, I want you to know there's a special place in hell for people like you. The volleyball players were about 22 at the time, and I'm still in contact with the guy who helped me out. He is now a police officer himself in a state a couple over from mine with a wonderful family, and he's a huge part of his community. Part of the service that he gives back is about what happened to me, how he reacted, and how all civilians can help out the police and everyone around them by doing the right thing. I have a family of my own now, and since birth I've preached to my kids, both my son and daughter, to be careful wherever they go, to always keep their guard up, and remember that they too can make a difference if they see something bad happening. They're 24 and 25 now, and I know they'll teach their kids the same. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel and share it with your friends. If you've got a true scary story of any nature that you would like me to narrate on this channel, please email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to take it a step further, find me on Patreon. Give a donation and keep this channel commercial free for the most part. I know I do have sponsors, but I try to keep them at a minimum. Everyone, I know it's a crazy time, and I just want you to know that I hope all of you are safe and being excellent to each other. Until next time, wash your hands, social distance, wear a mask, and remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost? A monster? Or the guy next door?